Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the 21st Talks podcast. My name is Coleman. How's everyone doing? I'm doing quite good. I got the chance to speak with Dr. Professor Kreps and a Cornell Ph.D. student named Amelia Arsenault. So Professor Kreps is a adjunct professor of law, professor in the Department of Government, and the director of the Cornell Tech Policy Lab here at Cornell. She also is a founding member of the Milstein Institute, and has done past work as a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. So when we talk about accredited people to discuss like tech policy, specifically international governance of emerging technologies in relation to AI, we can't do much better than Professor Kreps. She also is an incredible lecturer and so much fun to speak with. And Amelia Arsenault is currently co-authoring or just finished co-authoring a chapter in a larger book on governance of AI with a subsection in there on potential benefits. So we talk a lot about how artificial narrow intelligences are currently affecting and will continue to affect international governance as well as internal governance within nation states. And I get asked some of the big questions that have been on my mind in a lot of these interviews that I've been just absolutely waiting for a professor and a two-set scholar lineup of government experienced researchers to discuss and dive into with, because it's hard governing the world. That's not really a hot take to say. There's a reason why so much of international politics has just been people for 2,200 years talking about how to potentially interact between, foreign international bodies. And now in the 21st century, we get to do that, but with the added challenge of emerging technology on top of that. So to say that today's discussion was elucidating and illuminating to many of these, very, very challenging issues facing us in the 21st century, that is, I think, a no-brainer. So I hope you guys really enjoyed today's episode. Thank you so much to Justin and to our graphic designer, Jack, as well. Links to their stuff is in the description down below. Thank you to the entire 21st Talks team. Thank you to Dr. Professor Kreps, and of course to Amelia Arsenault. Thank you guys so much for coming on. And I am really, really excited to hopefully work with you guys at some point in the future, whether it's for 21st Talks or something else entirely. But I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day, and remember to like, rate, and subscribe, and enjoy the podcast. Let us know what you think of it down below. Within like the effective altruism community and different like X-risk circles, as you know from maybe some of my comments in class, many scholars argue that the AI we'll see in the coming decades, whether it's artificial general intelligence or narrow intelligence, will be transformative in nature, the transformative AI views. In other words, like many technological scholars argue that these technologies will be fundamentally shifting for global forces. And so the first question I was really curious about is, do you guys buy this? Like, do you think that the AI that we might see in the coming decades will fundamentally change how international politics happens in a way that like potentially past technologies may not have, or in a way that specifically within the military domains, like it might change the sort of military, build up conflict type dynamic we've seen for the last like 3,000 years potentially?
I think that's a great question and of fundamental importance, and something that it carries over across all emerging technologies. And in fact, there's a debate going on right now on drones, and the authors that wrote this piece in International Security, which is kind of a flagship journal in this space for academics, but also policymakers, are saying that so many people have argued that drones are revolutionary, and they try to dismantle this argument. And we're in the process of writing kind of a rebuttal to that and saying that putting the bar at revolutionary or transformative may not be the right measuring stick. Because I think what you're going to miss, if that's such a high bar, is all of the nuance and all of the important, even if somewhat subtle ways that these technologies can really have an impact. And so I think it's too broad a brush, and we can risk or kind of losing perspective by dismissing the technology by saying, well, it's not transformative, or being kind of almost threat inflationary by saying it's so transformative. And so I guess I sort of push back a little bit on that label and suggest that maybe it's not about putting it in a box or with a label, but really kind of thinking about the context and ways in which it might be changing politics or international politics.
Okay, well, you can go, Amelia.
Yeah, I feel similarly. In this chapter that Professor Kreps and I recently co-authored, we sort of argue that although we've seen real technological advances in things like machine vision and data analytics that have greatly improved what we can accomplish with AI and how much interest and investment there is in this technology. We sort of argue that a lot of the consequences that are being discussed in relation to AI may not actually be that unique to the AI era. Some of those consequences include disinformation, polarization, weapons automation, which you mentioned, surveillance, competition between the US and China. And so we sort of argue that these are not consequences that result solely from AI proliferation, but instead are sort of pre-existing trends that we argue might be exacerbated or intensified by AI. So disinformation becoming increasingly targeted and precise, like weapons becoming, operating with higher degrees of autonomy, worsening things like income inequality potentially. But again, it's important that we clarify that just because AI is an enabling force and not the singular cause of these trends, it doesn't mean that it's unimportant or inconsequential. And we don't think that it's going to fade away from international politics.
Yeah, it'd be hard to kind of foresee any scenarios where AI becomes not relevant in the future, right? And I think that's one nice certainty about studying like AI with Lionel Levine, a professor here in the math department, and I, along with a couple PhDs, are starting an organization called Laser, right? Which we just got funding for. It's an AI safety lab here at Cornell. And that's like one of the big sort of marketing components of it, right? Like trying to get PhDs to sign on for some research and prioritize AI research. It's like, yeah, AI is not going to become less pertinent, either technologically or within international or internal like politics. And that's something that I'm really interested in hearing more about. It's a question that's been on my mind for most of the course this year that I was lucky enough to take with both of you. But I'm curious, when it comes to artificial intelligence and democracy, we're seeing trends of backsliding. And we're also seeing historical trends of generally just like people not really being too enthusiastic about buying into their communities. And this is, has been heavily documented within the moral psychology literature and political psychology literature that I'm so fascinated by here at Cornell. And I'm just curious, do you see artificial intelligence as posing a incredibly large threat to democracy as a destabilizing force, right? And if so, what do you think the primary drivers are?
Yeah, I think disinformation is one where we've already seen, obviously not being unique to liberal democracies, but having serious consequences in terms of, ability to access credible or accurate information. And again, this is sort of exacerbated by concerns about the rise of deepfakes, psychometric analysis, this sort of thing. I think that what's challenging about this, and has been argued previously, is that democracies might actually face a unique challenge in addressing AI-mediated disinformation just because of the importance of freedom of speech, where efforts to curb disinformation may be characterized as infringements upon that fundamental democratic right.
Yeah,
and I just think really quickly as well that the threat posed by AI for liberal democracies, I think we spend a lot of time talking about the threat coming from sort of foreign actors that use it in interesting ways, but I actually think that democracies are going to have to grapple with how they adopt this domestically and what sort of uses they'll see as legitimate or illegitimate, and how they can sort of reduce some of the threats to democratic values.
If I could just step in on that point and connecting also with AI, one of the things that we've looked at empirically is whether it's possible through natural language models to generate large scale misinformation or disinformation campaigns. And this comes back a little bit to your the question you led with, which is how transformative AI technology is. And we fielded an experiment that randomized AI generated content and human written content to state legislators. And we found that this was actually really difficult to pull off. And so that's sort of the way in which this threads with these earlier conversations, which is, I think 5 years ago, there was a sense that the AI genie had kind of launched out of the bottle. And I think that maybe due to the efforts of groups that brought awareness to these risks, I think that has slowed down the speed of evolution or revolution. And I think this is a way in which, coming back to the natural language models and whether you can kind of astroturf these members of Congress to the point where they think, oh, there's such a groundswell of support behind this gun control initiative, we better go do it or not do it. It turns out it's really hard. And what we found in several cases actually is that these state capitals were on alert because of these efforts and drew attention to their legal counsel and different kind of levers of accountability. And one of our takeaways was actually fairly optimistic in terms of the ease with which this can be done. We worked really hard at it, and it's really difficult to pull off. So I think just kind of taking a narrow slice of that, I think some of those AI grounded threats to democracy through misinformation are not that easy.
But can you tell us a little bit more about that? Specifically, why is it? So it's your research found that the natural language models as a way to astroturf politicians by just sending them mass amounts of allegedly in support of certain policies to try to change their overall sort of political outlook, what they think the actual democratic body wants. Is that what the research specifically was looking at? And
that's what it was.
You're saying
exactly.
that, Okay,
and
that is,
yeah.
Oh yeah.
And it was so there were so many steps that it took. I mean, we've been working on this now for 3 years. And we're still we did a beta test that mostly worked, we mostly executed, but that was the one where we saw that there was some evidence. I mean, it was a bit of it was a real challenge. But the response rates were largely on par with each other between the human and the AI written. But what really kind of tipped some people off was that you have to create, all these email accounts that sound like credible email accounts and don't go into the spam filters. And I think especially since 2016, so many parts of different legislatures are so alert and sensitized to these threats that it really is kind of hard to break through these firewalls in ways that first you have to get through, and then you actually have to kind of create enough of a momentum, a perceived momentum behind a policy.
So the AI, oh, sorry.
No, just to add on this, even with deep fakes, I mean, I think there is this threat of deep fakes, but it's let's be real. Everyone knows the difference between the real Tom Cruise videos and the deep fake videos. So I'm just not sure. I feel like there was a lot of sort of hype of these threats that isn't frankly backed up by the technology.
That's a fair point. And I mean, a lot of it might be due to efficiency of specific algorithms. I know that before the 2012 breakthrough from I think it was the deep learning breakthrough, right? In terms of the amount of faith in AI's ability to actually overcome what we thought were historical barriers, the amount of data we could potentially process was overcome from social media, and just the massive amount of data that we now have on individuals, and then the computational layers of not having enough data or not enough energy to supply the computations of different deep mind or deep learning programs. All those things seem like they've been slowly getting overcome. And I don't know if either of you guys have either you guys seen the DALL-E 2 images that have recently been circulating out of I think OpenAI off of their new image generalization. They're incredible.
Amazing.
And the thing is they're, so we can look at it in terms of direct impact of like bad actors or potentially like, mixed bag actors who either from like maliciousness or just a desire to like make a bit of profit or something, exploit AI technology in a way that destabilizes democracy, right? But we can also look at it in the sense from another perspective of like AI's ramifications for society that then have like trickle down effects, or not trickle down, downstream effects. I mean, and some of those I'd be really interested in hear your thoughts on specifically within in regards to automation, especially is something that I think might really destabilize the sort of the what kind of has girdled and protected the bulwark of democracy, of liberal democracies. Seems like people's ability to mobilize in mass has kind of been contingent on their ability to, say, we're not going to work. Like, we're not going to, allow this to happen anymore. And unionization, other things like that have been really effective political means to, grow representation in sort of unfair societies, or very unfair societies. And I'm curious, do you guys think AI will make it harder, and just automation more broadly taking jobs potentially? Do you see that having trickle, downstream effects? I mean, again, that might have even more disastrous effects than like, what you're saying in terms of like a bad actor trying to send a bunch of emails to a potential like senator or something. Do you think that like the downstream effects might outweigh the purposeful sort of bad actor effects? Because they're harder to protect against, I think.
Yeah, I think because they're in a way hiding in plain sight. There's like an insidiousness because they're just kind of with us every day. And, I guess I've mixed feelings on that in the sense that, I mean, on the, as we've talked about in class, in the context of automation and labor, I mean, in a lot of ways, we're in a very different place now than we were also 5 years ago or 3 years ago. Is that labor, there was a real concern that automation would displace labor. But now we have a labor shortage, and we had COVID, and there were certain jobs that weren't sort of hygienic or safe. And automation seemed like a really good kind of solution to all of those limitations. And so it's hard to sort of isolate and ascertain kind of how problematic these downstream consequences are. I mean, one we haven't talked about that I think is really important in terms of democracy is that even if sort of the prevalence and ubiquity of these, whether it's deep fakes or sort of manufactured AI generated text, can lead to such a sense that you don't actually know either way, whether there's so much like overwhelming noise in the system. People just are dismissive of everything, and they just assume everything is, or they can't trust anything. And something that's so fundamental in democracy is that idea of trust, that you trust news, you trust your political leaders, you trust your community leaders. And if you can't know with certainty anymore that these forms of information are trustworthy, maybe you just discount it altogether. And I think really sort of the edifice of the democracy really falls apart.
Yeah, you can't have democracy without trust. I think that's a point that I've talked around a little bit in some of the other interviews we've done, but we haven't had like directly sort of explicitly stated before like that. So like, thank you so much. I also know you have to run in a couple of minutes, and I'm curious at 1, right? Don't you have a meeting at 1? Oh, you don't? Oh, good. Okay. Well, in that case, I wanted, we should definitely return back to the questions of AI affecting existing political regimes and how we might be able to reform or change them. Especially, I really want to talk about the Westphalian sense of sovereignty and like whether or not we think like sovereign nation states are the best way to like deal with like emerging technologies like AI. Because, just the rational actor game it puts us in is like very, very bad. That's like a good proportion of risk out of the gate. But real quick, so the class that we keep referencing for our listeners is this year. This semester, I took a class taught by the two of you who are on politics of technology, and I wanted to ask, like, why did you decide to teach that? Because it's like I had people in the EA community reach out to me, and like I'd like post something on my story from like a reading from class or something, or like I would like say something to a friend about this really cool class I was taking, and people were like, "Oh, you're taking class where you guys are talking about like AI and not just like AI automation, but also just like these larger sort of dynamics going on with technology." So I just want to ask, like, what like motivated you guys to actually like want to create this curriculum and like teach it?
So I'm part of still part of a program called the Milstein Program in Technology and Humanity. And that's actually I've worked on technology and policy for more time than I was about to admit. But I did it in a military context. And, and that just raises such fundamental questions about, you have radar systems and you have airplanes and I think I thought a lot about those questions. And so I'd always been drawn to tech policy, but this program was created a few years ago that the aim was to attract people who were CS, but also something else. And I think the idea, which I really support and which I hope comes through in the class, is that we can't only think about whether it's possible to develop a certain technology. So just because you can develop it doesn't mean you should. And conditional on it being developed, there are a lot of questions of how people think about it, how people interact with the technology. And I think those kinds of questions were at the heart of this Milstein program that I was part of. And actually, as part of that, we were expected to develop a class. And this was the one I developed. And so it just felt really fundamental. But it's funny because I'll talk to people that I advise on North Campus, freshmen who are engineering majors or CS majors, and I tell them about these AI classes or tech classes, and they get really kind of deflated when they realize that they might be forced to ask hard questions about the use of what the technologies are developing. So I think this is exactly the point, though, of classes like that. And Amelia has been working this space for a long time too. So I'd really like to hear her jump in.
Yeah, I would love to hear.
Yeah, I think what is so great about this class is really the diversity of the students' backgrounds. Like Professor Kreps was getting at, I think it's been so nice to have those students from the CS background who can give us a little bit of insight into what their instruction is too. In terms of whether or not they're engaging with these sorts of questions. And then we have students that come from a wide variety of different social science backgrounds, including government and international relations, who can sort of bring that side to the discussion. So it's been really great. And what I love about the class too is that such a broad range of issue areas that we look at. Sarah, I know you are eventually going to be teaching a class just on AI, but I think we did to your credit, I think the class covers a very wide range of issues relating to tech and politics more broadly, as opposed to just, singularly focusing on the military aspect. So it's been a great opportunity to participate in.
And that's what I'm curious about. Something else is, so a lot of like politics and technology discussions that I feel like I read outside of effective altruism or existential risk context largely are contingent or focused on, I should say, on like military adoptions and military advancements in this technological race with like fun rational actor issues. And I know Lionel Levine is doing a lot of work on game theory that's like incredible to see from an AI perspective, and a lot of EA and X-risk literature like reflects that game theory stuff, and especially like studying like behavioral like science, it like very, very heavily embedded in just like other things I'm also interested in. But I'm curious, like, do you think that larger discussions in terms of like the novel challenges that AI presents on an international sphere from outside of a military context, do you think that those get enough attention within these like discussions, or do you think that currently we kind of need a little bit more of those outside of the military context of how lethal autonomous weapons are used, for example, even though it's absolutely critically important? I was just curious to ask you guys, especially in terms of like how it affects international treaties on cooperation or potential technological races too.
I think that it's perhaps understandable that, that was my first introduction to the world of AI, was sort of like robot wars and this very dystopian sort of applications of AI. So I think on one hand, it is something that gets a lot of attention because it's interesting and a bit, sensational, if you will. But what I do think is important is, again, not just focusing on the potential threat that comes from other foreign actors, but also how countries themselves are adopting it domestically. But also, I think there are actually a lot of really interesting military and defense applications of AI that are less about lethal autonomous weapons and more about some of what we talked about in class in terms of like machine learning, AI to analyze drone footage with what we see with Project Maven, but also to enhance military organization and planning. So I think that it's definitely an important conversation given the concern, the potential risks. But I think that conversations about AI and military should be expanded a little bit beyond the lethal autonomous focus.
Yeah. Professor Kreps, what's on your mind? Do you look like you're thinking?
Good question. I mean, I think it's so great that you mentioned other people who are working in this space. And one of the things we're trying to do at Cornell is figure out kind of who else is working on related issues, because it can be very easy to just be siloed and you're so deep into your own work that and I think there are just so many kind of academic and disciplinary pressures to just be in your own kind of narrow silo.
Yeah, digging deep. Yeah, and like try to, get that slightly more cutting edge paper release in order to secure a bit more tenure,
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think, but then the more of these kind of cross-cutting interdisciplinary conversations that can go on, I actually think that their impact on society will be much greater even. And I'm excited to read more of these game theory papers. And those I think are foundational to solving these bigger questions, but I don't think that they in isolation can be necessarily no pun intended, but game changers in terms of addressing some of these existential risk questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one thing I love about the X-Risk community. And I just sent a link to one of CSER, which is like Cambridge's X-Risk Institute, and also the home of some of my favorite people on planet Earth. But Karen Coleman is this like really, really cool lawyer and researcher. I think she's now I think she is no longer just a PhD candidate. I think she is doing her she may have completed it now, but she wrote a really great paper called "Sexy and Unsexy Risks in Global Catastrophic Risk," and specifically, it's just to quote her, it's sexy risks get more resources and airtime, while unsexy risks tend to be neglected, downplayed, and or recharacterized as something else. These different responses are not necessarily rational and are best understood as a function of the complexity and creep of certain problems and how they play on our cognitive biases and behavioral weaknesses. Unsexy risks are undeniably awkward, but may be far, far more urgent than some more attractive risks. And this is something that I'm especially interested in terms of, we had a week where we were discussing like asteroid protection, right? And that tends to be a very, very robustly attractive risk for people to look at, even though it may not get enough attention or enough funding or all those big issues. But when working with like finite resources, I'm really, really curious to hear your guys' take on whether or not you think like AI has a similar selection effect based off of like the attractability or even perhaps like how much media there is about certain types of risk, right? So I think a good example of this is like the classic like Terminator example that I luckily have not heard for a few months now. And anytime we talk about AI, typically though, it's one of the first responses is like, oh, like killer robots, right? And like absolutely, that's a component, Amelia, as you were saying. That's one of the ways in which I got started to get interested in these things as well. But it seems like a lot of it is like sort of outside of what there currently is media relating to. So I want to ask like your guys' opinion on like how do you think like good media or good portrayals of these issues can help make certain topics more attractive to discuss or more attractive to do research in, because that might help stem some of this sort of like interdisciplinary this issue of people being too siloed, I guess, right? In some way.
Yeah, I think you're right. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just thinking that there's a peril, I think, in trying to turn or sort of pitch an unsexy risk as a sexy one, because
yeah.
I mean, because of the way I feel like that's what the subtext of this is that we have all these sort of threats that are hiding in plain sight because they're our day to day, and and we lose sight of them because they're not sexy, and that if only we could package them as this really sort of
the Ryan Gosling of hazards facing humanity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Try making soil erosion cool, right?
That's a really good example. Yeah.
Just kidding. I do love soil erosion. I do think it's a very, very attractive risk to work on. Shout out to all my ag people. But sorry, please go on.
That was actually, I did a master's at Oxford, and the director of the program studied soil erosion. And I swear that I love this guy, but I think this is why I changed disciplines. I was like, I can't study dirt for the rest of my life. So I don't know. You want to be taken seriously as an academic rather than sort of peddling or like, some sort of charlatan pitching your issue as being something, it reminds me a little bit of when there would be, economists will do this, is that for years they'll talk about their pet issue, whether it's like inflation or recession or unemployment. And like eventually they're right because like the economy is cyclical. But I do think that I'm trying to think of sort of how to address what you're talking about without being sort of intellectually disingenuous.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a very fair point. Amelia, what were you thinking?
I think it's a good question. I think, again, it's kind of well represented by the common introduction for people who study this stuff being the robot wars. When, especially talking about existential risk, I think the other side of the argument is that the actual existential risk that comes from AI could potentially be something as unsexy as like the black box problem or the complexity, inability to understand the way that algorithms make decisions. So it is difficult because on one hand, I think a lot of us here are proof that emphasizing the more maybe sensational sides of the conversation can get people interested and aware in a way that allows them to sort of broaden their understanding of what AI is and where the benefits and risks lie. But at the same time, I agree with Sarah that it's probably not useful or fair to frame things in the more sexy way, if you will.
Yeah. No, that's a very fair point. Do you think it's like in terms of how you guys have your sort of pedagogical like approach to teaching about AI, emphasizing the benefits that can bring us is something that when I was speaking with Catherine Rhodes in the last like group podcast interview we did with also Luke Kemp, also happened both to be from Caesar. Some people I was referencing a little earlier ago. But Catherine was very, very careful to emphasize that bio risks is where she's especially interested. That bio risks do not just reflect like incredible dangers to humanity, but reflect incredible capabilities for like doing good as well, right? And that that's the effective altruism in effective altruism. That's the true aim of the community is not just to mitigate bad, but to maximize good. And I've started to come around to this idea that maybe not transformative AI based off the critique of the term earlier, which I think was very fair, but I think incredibly impactful AI, especially general intelligence stuff, optimized and used correctly within human society can really, really make humanity flourish like to the stars, quite literally. And is that something that like, is that a sentiment that you guys hold as well? Or is it, has it been a little bit challenging to like, keep some of the optimism in mind as well, while looking at all the, downsides and like really scary challenges that we're facing in this century?
Yeah, maybe I'll just start. When Sarah and I were drafting this chapter where we take sort of a broad look at what AI is going to mean for international politics, I think there is, again, somewhat of a natural inclination to discuss risks or be a little bit pessimistic. But eventually we also incorporated, a section about the ways that AI could potentially be designed or used to reduce some of the concerns, or as you mentioned, be really beneficial for society. So I think that was important for us, but also for me, individually as an academic, to think a little bit broader about what this could mean and how AI can be introduced in ways that mitigate some of those risks, but also create like really desirable opportunities.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about some of those opportunities that you guys like go over in that section? Because I remember reading and it was, I believe it was in the section, the draft that you sent me.
Yeah. I mean, one example that we really hear in relation to like smart city technologies is potentially being able to enhance efficiency in a way that makes city living more sustainable or improves access to services and resources. Another example that is generating a lot of interest is using AI to make education and schooling more personalizable, more adaptable. Could potentially be used to sort of empower people by rapidly, synthesizing large amounts of information. I think there's also interest in applying it to democratic governance more specifically in terms of, allowing citizens to better maybe track politicians' performance, strengthen communication. And I don't know how much this has been explored in really like empirical research yet, but I do think there's a lot of interest in potentially using AI to facilitate a more open and accountable relationship between leaders and citizens.
Yeah, I think that this careful perspective is really important. My sense of these debates is that they're very bifurcated or bimodal. Is the kind of tech people, this is a caricature, but the tech people who will kind of, again, have this view of, well, what can be done? Can we do it? And this other side that is just like pulling the emergency brake. And I feel like there has to be space in the middle, but that space, I think, has not been occupied by many voices. And I've really thought about kind of why that might be. And I wonder if it sort of comes back to the sexy versus unsexy. It's sort of unsexy to say, well, nuance is really important. It's like, I just think that our media environment is much more sort of showcases the voices that are more bombastic, that are more inflationary. But I think the more people that can have that perspective have, hey, look, if we kind of pull the emergency brake, there are a lot of possible opportunity costs, but we don't want to put the foot on the gas without like considering, what guardrails we need in place.
Yeah, and because I think there's a lot of what's the Silicon Valley motto? It's move fast and break things, right? That's has been absolutely disastrous for like security of softwares that have now become fundamental to like the economic system, and more importantly, like just the actual like how we get important things to places in the world around us. With the like oil pipeline example this summer, especially. Yeah. And so I think that like I think that Silicon Valley is learning within that. And beyond that, when it comes to artificial general intelligence, especially, it's like we have one shot at it, and it is something that might just rapidly happen, like within a very, very short time horizon. There was the newest paper released as a compilation of different like leading scholars in artificial general intelligence safety, the newest AI timelines, or AGI timelines, I mean. And I think it was something like, I don't want to misquote it, but it was something to the effect of, a 50% chance of artificial general intelligence from, the opinion of these experts in a wide variety of backgrounds by like 2050, right? And artificial general intelligence occurring is, it might just be that from a technical standpoint, out of the 99.99 times, universes where it might happen, right? Like, almost all of those are cases where it is unaligned, and it tries to maximize, for example, like paper clips or something else, right, that is not aligned with human flourishing, right? And I think the thing that's so interesting to me about governance of AI is there's an international governance especially, but as Amelia has been wonderfully pointing out, like internally within states as well, is there's like sort of like two levels of it, right? There's like direct implications of AI right now. Then there's also like, how do we set up structures and treaties to make sure that artificial general intelligence is designed, but has that sort of like middle of the road, safety and also opportunity cost, in mind with it. And that I think our international like system is just not set up for that currently. And I think that's one of the most fundamental issues facing us today. And like, that's why like I want to go into politics. Like, that's why like I want to communicate. Like it's largely because of these underlying systems that like absolutely need to be reformed. But also I recognize that they have worked to some degree to stabilize the world over the last few hundred years, especially. And messing with that is a fundamental risk, right? So I just want to ask you guys, in terms of people, just in terms of your views, do you think that the international sort of like, sovereign state system or treaty system will be able to stamp to the call to action that artificial general intelligence especially, puts states in? Because I just like, this is on my mind constantly right now, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts.
Amelia, you should give the optimist view.
Sure.
The pessimistic realist view.
Yeah, I think I tend to be a bit of a pessimist about this as well. Just because I think right now with the excitement and the investment that we're seeing in AI, I don't know how likely it is that states are going to want to place limitations on what they can do. But I suppose, and I think there's also challenges with even sharing definitions of precisely what these things mean. And I think you've seen this with the lethal autonomous weapons conversation, like where is the threshold for how much autonomy would be sufficient to, cross the red line. But I think in terms of maybe if I try to frame it more optimistically, I think in order to have a degree of international cooperation, you would need to have a recognition that there's a shared interest in pursuing that cooperation, trust that there will be some degree of compliance. It's best if there are ways to have standards and rules, but also ways to enforce or monitor those rules. I think that's obviously very difficult with something like AI, and especially as well because AI is so dual use, that it's very difficult, I think, to put those real limitations on it right now. So I'm not sure how optimistic that is, but
no, I think you said exactly what I was thinking. I don't know why I thought you'd be a little bit more hopeful. Maybe because you're younger. I just feel like, state interests are not very compatible for most of the reasons you said with putting constraints on these things. They've invested all this money. And there's, I think, such a sort of like prisoner's dilemma about, why would we constrain the way we use these technologies? Because we can't ascertain that Russia won't use these technologies. So if they do, well, we should. And so I think especially right now, kind of with the state of the world as it is, where there is a lot of distrust, and you need a lot of trust that goes in sort of as a precursor for international agreements. I just don't see how we get to a place where the states that are developing and using these technologies are going to collectively say that they're going to sort of constrain how they develop or use them.
Yeah, and when it comes to a theory of change for this, I guess 2 points. First, absolutely love the fact that you're in some of the advising that you do for some of the engineer and CS students here at Cornell. You try to point out like, hey, it's not like can you do it? It's like should you to some degree? Because I live in Hans Beta Hall, and I walk past the man's I think it is Nobel Prize like on a daily basis. And every time I wait for food, like I'll be like waiting with my girlfriend or something, talking about like whatever, and I'll look up and every time it catches me, and it's always just in big bold letters. Yes, I can do that. It's just like everywhere in Hans Beta. Yes, I can do it. His catchphrase, right? And mind you, this is a man who, when he was working on the Manhattan Project, gave like bad reasoning and like essentially just like bad math. Like he made math up essentially and showed Oppenheimer and other leading physicists like, hey, of course, like this bomb won't catch the atmosphere on fire, right? Like when these physicists were like coalescing at I think Oppenheimer's office was at UC Berkeley. Like they had secret meetings before they started working for the US government. And like they were trying to determine like, will this catch the atmosphere on fire? And Hans Bethe was like, no, it won't. And everyone was like, how, like, thank you. Like, how do you know that? Like, show us your proof. And he was like, oh, I just know it won't. It's like, he was just so focused on getting the bomb built that he was wrong. And ultimately, it didn't catch the atmosphere on fire. Although the Trinity test, there was several people who started crying hysterically when it went off because it happened a little bit longer than they were expecting because the load was a bit bigger because in part because some calculations that beta had gone inaccurate. But more importantly, when we were doing different element-based detonations later, some of the I think it was it a lithium bomb? I forget what bomb. But the Castle Bravo tests were so much bigger than we meant to be because of the thing that Han Beta was so certain when it happened. And that's like, it's like precisely, and luckily it didn't catch the entire atmosphere on fire, right? Thank God. But the fact that one scientist at one point in history could have gone, just was like in a room of people went, oh no, like we can gamble with humanity's like entire future, right? Literally, the chance of setting all air on fire in the atmosphere, or I guess in that case it would be a hydrogen detonation. But nonetheless, it's like, that's terrifying. And it seems like that is happening in the 21st century. And I would be amiss if someone in my cohort at Cornell or any of my friends at any other CS programs around the world were to be the ones to Hans Beta artificial general intelligence, right? And if you ask the average CS major, it's like they typically don't take ethics courses, right? It's very, very rare, very, very rare. And we have all these case studies from history of like engineers doing something wrong, and not to pit on like engineers specifically, but taking that pause and asking ourselves like, what might this do? Should I create this technology? Should I work for this X company? Like that is, I think, absolutely fundamental for like human survival this century. And I think that's one of the missions of the podcast here is like having some like fun, nerdy conversations to like hopefully get some CS people listening and, hopefully get some other engineers listening in addition to the philosophers and psychologists and all those people. Right. Because we are really in it together. And I think that our nation state model doesn't reflect the fact that we like literally do better when other people are also doing good. It's not a zero-sum game. And I feel like the Westphalian sense of sovereignty was written in a time where, like, philosophically, the political opinion of the day was we lived in a zero-sum world, right? There was only so much piece of that pie. And I just like, I think that like a model that represents how much more successful we are cooperatively is really beneficial. And I think that's what like sort of international sort of trade has been showing us to some degree. So I'm curious, like when it comes to nuclear bombs and case studies, I'm almost done with this preamble, I promise. When it comes to cases where trust has worked in our favor, in terms of creating like international treaties and stuff, I think one that is like kind of a weird, dark example almost, nuclear bombs. The fact that the US trusted that Russia would bomb us back if we bombed them first, that mutually assured a destruction. Do you guys think that potentially there could be a viable alternative for AI governance based off of a similar sort of protocol? Again, very, very dark proposition, but I think like that is kind of like the hour that the clock is at this point. So I'm just curious, like, do you think mutually assured destruction via AI is something that might be a substantive way to build international treaties to like do it right, do it safely?
I think you're right that nuclear weapons are an example where there's a clear existential risk that affects international governance, some degree of shared, recognition of the risk. But I think, again, you still do see powerful interests in countries that have already got those capabilities that are unwilling to give them up. So I suppose, again, with the trend of being a little more pessimistic, I'm not convinced that countries like, the US or China that have really been big players in this space are going to want to slow down. And I think too, a broader challenge is there's a real knowledge gap, I think, between developers of technology and policymakers. And this is, again, something we've talked about throughout the semester. But if you can't understand this technology, it's hard to properly prepare for it and ensure that we have the appropriate infrastructure in place to deal with those potential consequences, which I think is made more difficult by the speed at which we're seeing those improvements.
Which in the 1960s, it would have been, we're concerned scientists, we should get some, US politicians or international, folks involved in doing some, knowing the importance of nuclear, nuclear disarmament treaties and things like that. And you would take them to a nuclear detonation. Be like, oh, look how big and scary this is. Like, let's show you footage of like this bomb going off, and like that was sufficient. But with AI, it's you're totally right. It's like it is uniquely challenging to demonstrate because we're talking about like a little angry God in a box potentially, in addition to the lethal autonomous weapons and the vision technology and all those things, which are a little bit more demonstratable, I presume. What are you thinking, Professor Kreps?
So I was thinking about how these prohibitions or not sort of arms control agreements did not come about in the nuclear context until almost 20 years after that test in New Mexico and after that Castle Bravo test and after the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And I think that in a way that the sort of concept behind what you're saying is provocative and potentially useful, but I think that it in a way gets the sequence off.
Yeah.
Because what the analogy would be, could we have gotten a preemptive agreement not to develop the bomb in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah.
And it's hard, I think. So why didn't Hans Bethe do that? Well, he was a scientist. He wanted to see if it could be done. And Germany was doing it. And then the Soviet Union was doing it. And so, but also because I don't think it was very clear what the consequences could be. And so, the counterfactual question is whether these, whether even there would have been an impetus and coalescence around arms control with the partial test ban treaty in 1963 had the Cuban Missile Crisis not happened, or had this Castle Bravo test not been like catastrophically off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I guess I share your worry in a way that it might only be possible to get momentum behind this kind of agreement in an ex-post kind of world once we have developed and seen the consequences of the technology.
Which with AGI, we will not have the ability to. And I think one, speaking with, how should I say, okay, just for my Ed or Justin's sake, I'm not going to say, but there's an AI researcher I was talking with recently, and he was asked, what is the sign of us like getting to AGI that like you'll see, because it's hard to tell if we like reach that point. And his response was like, oh, well, like if we start seeing the economy do things we're not used to, like doubling, in 3 years, like that's like specifically what he's looking out for. Okay. And that's like specifically what he's looking out for as a mode. So imagine like us being in a world, right? It's 20, 25 years from now. And, everything is going a little bit suspiciously good, right? That might be a sign to some AI researchers that like, hey, we should probably put the brakes on this thing. We should probably check this a little bit more. And the issue with that is, we're probably not that difficult to map like psychologically as a species, right? It's hard when you're in the vessel, but I'm sure from the outside, it's like, manipulating humans is not exactly going to be the hardest thing ever for an artificial general intelligence. And because of that, like just giving us a little bit of like benefit might just be enough to stave off any developmental costs that it might like recognize as like potentially, devastating for its own ability to accumulate like a maximization of utility or something like that. But even outside of that context, like preemptively, I absolutely see what you're saying. It's like, I don't think we could have stopped the US from cultivating a bomb whatsoever. And I know that's not controversial whatsoever. Right. And
in a way,
I'm so concerned.
Yeah, no, I mean, like also what you're saying is like, there's a clear threshold of like, oh, this thing just did a huge amount of damage versus I think there's such incrementalism. How will we know when we got to AGI?
Exactly. Right. And that's a question that like very few researchers in the field, like people have strong opinions, but like no one's gonna be like, this is definitively the answer. And if they are, they're like, that's not the best way to go about it. Like everyone has their own sort of litmus test for it. Yeah. I as a sort of closing question, next year, if you're teaching the politics tech course again, what would I have to do to have you guys do a week on X risks more broadly?
You can just send us some readings and
that's it.
Yeah, that easy. Okay. No, but it's going to be the politics of artificial intelligence next spring.
Oh, hell yeah. You're going to be updated. Sweet. That's so good to hear.
What year are you?
Yeah. I'm a junior currently, so
Oh, so
I
you can
will
take that
certainly be
too.
taking that as well. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I know the course has been so much fun. Yeah, easily the one most like enjoyable classes this semester. So yeah, I really, really appreciate it. And thank you guys so much for like coming on and talking.
I just think what you're doing
yeah.
is so impressive. And
Thank you.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate in this incredible thing you've put together.
Thank you so much. I also would love to get more involved with the Milstein program. I'd love to hear more about what you guys are doing and how that's doing. So Amelia, are you involved? Are you working with the Milstein program as well? Is that a part of the work you're doing, or
No,
you're not?
but I will just
Okay.
plug, I guess, while we're here, the Tech Policy Lab at Cornell is doing a lot of really exciting work right now on a range of tech-related issues, from sort of
Hell yeah.
vaccines,
And-
COVID vaccines, to smart cities, drones, all
Cyber and
sorts.
space.
Space,
And
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I can now announce that it will be a Tech Policy Institute as of July 1st, which is
Ooh.
great. Yeah, a little bit
Okay.
more ambitious in its scope. So
It's quite fun.
it's a growth area, unfortunately, in a way. But I mean, I think these are the communities that should be having the conversations about which technologies we develop and how we use them.
I think some sort of emerging technology symposium next year. I was telling Amelia about my involvement in Cornell Effective Altruism as like president next year.
I love that idea.
Yeah, it's like we're going to be doing symposiums anyway, so we could do a live podcast interview in front of a bunch of people and have some good experts on and panel of people.
All right.
So that'd be really fun.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for coming on. Yeah.
Thank you, Coleman.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys
Been
so
great.
much. It was a great conversation. All right.
Thanks.
Have a good one.
Take care.